My name's Erin Taylor. I'm a junior here at Calvin studying biology and global development studies, and I am a member of the student leadership team of the Science and Religion Forum. We are very excited to sponsor today's lecture with the generous support of a scholarship in Christianity in Oxford Supporting Structures grant funded by the John Templeton Foundation. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Hall. Dr. Hall is a professor of psychology in the Rosemead School of Psychology at Biola University. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and associate editor of Psychology of Religion and Spirituality, the premier journal in the psychology of religion field. Dr. Hall is a licensed psychologist in California and has published over 100 articles and book chapters, bringing together psychology and Christian theology on a variety of topics, including embodiment, religious doubt, virtues, motherhood, gender issues, missions, and mental health. She has received numerous awards for her scholarship, and most recently, her work has been focused on meaning in the context of suffering. Just 2 years ago in 2021, she and her husband, Dr. Todd Hall, published the book, Relational Spirituality, a Psychological Theological Paradigm for Transformation. So today we are so grateful to have Dr. Hall here with us to speak with us about how we as Christians can more effectively engage one another in conversations about difficult topics. So thank you all for coming, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Hall.
So many thanks to Dr. Beebe and to the Science and Religion Forum for this invitation and for the warm welcome that the Calvin community has given me today. Pleased to be here with you today. Last summer, I decided to reread the Harry Potter series. And this time around, in the first book, the character who really caught my attention was not Harry nor even his closest friends, Hermione and Ron. And instead, I found myself really intrigued by an unlikely hero, Neville Longbottom. Now, Neville is not flashy. He doesn't stand out among his peers. He's not particularly good-looking or talented, but he's humble and brave and kind. He's a loyal friend and a fierce supporter, and he's actually capable of great courage when needed. Every fan of the series remembers that choice that Neville had to make in the final hour. He thinks that Harry's dead, that his side has lost, and he's given the chance to join Voldemort's forces and do the easy thing. And instead, he pulls Godric Gryffindor's sword out of the sorting hat and destroys the final Horcrux by slicing off the head of the serpent Nagini. But Neville's first act of courage, recorded in the series, actually comes in the first book, where he stands up to Harry and Ron and Hermione, who return the favor by putting him in a body bind. His heroism is actually recognized by Dumbledore, who in the last pages of the book rewards him with the final points that are needed to grant Gryffindor the House Cup. And Dumbledore prefaces this reward with the following words. He says, "It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but a great deal more to stand up to our friends." And so today I want to talk to you about speaking the truth in love and how doing this requires generosity and humility, and perhaps especially for the college students here today, courage. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're living in a divided, polarized society in which people with different perspectives, including different perspectives about the relationship between faith and science, have lost the ability to communicate with each other in order to work out their differences. And this shows up in many ways. In public discourse, what people say in news outlets and in social media, research has demonstrated a new trend in this polarization. So in the past, polarization could be seen primarily in terms of the content of what was being discussed, in terms of the opinions under discussion. In other words, people became more and more entrenched in their own positions. But more recently, there has been a new and disturbing trend, an increase in affective polarization. So it's not just that people are disagreeing about the issues, but they also dislike and distrust people who hold opinions different than their own. In a recent article in The Atlantic, psychologist Jonathan Haidt compared the current situation in America to the Tower of Babel. As the story is told in the book of Genesis, God confused the language of the people so that no one understood anyone else. And Haidt traced how, in our context, social media has contributed to this erosion of trust, how it has amplified this polarization around controversial topics. And in fact, people who try to resist this trend, people who try to be more nuanced or moderate in their opinions, are often attacked and shamed, not by people on the opposing side, but by their own side. And Haidt concluded this article by saying, when our public square is governed by mob dynamics, unrestrained by due process, we don't get justice and inclusion. We get a society that ignores context, proportionality, mercy, and truth. And so you students are inheriting a very troubled cultural moment, one that should concern all of us who care about truth. And of course, this communication crisis carries over into the classroom. And so a recent report commissioned by the Heterodox Academy found that high percentages of students on college campuses are very reluctant to discuss controversial topics, things like politics and religion and sexual orientation. And in fact, they say that fear of a negative reaction from or retribution from fellow students is the primary thing that keeps them quiet. I've noticed this in my own classroom, where people seem more reluctant than they used to in the past to disagree with each other in class conversations. Many students stay silent instead of engaging in these types of discussions. And the problem is that this erodes the purposes of a college education. A college education is supposed to teach you how to think well in order to become good citizens of a democratic society. And it turns out that when you only hear one perspective, you just don't learn to think as well. You're never forced to think through the weaknesses in your own position. You're never forced to clearly and politely articulate your own position. And you're never taught how to change your mind if it's warranted. But when your education is characterized by vigorous discussion around controversial topics, your horizons are expanded and you learn how to think more deeply about your own perspective, and overall you become a more nuanced and complex thinker. So when professors and classmates don't express diverse perspectives because of the fear of being shamed or ostracized or canceled or called out, everybody loses. And so today I want us to consider the claim that as Christians, our engagement with others around controversial topics should be characterized by speaking the truth in love. The very solution to this kind of affective polarization that I'm talking about. Love is supposed to infuse both the content of what we say, but also our modes of engagement with each other. And specifically, I'd like to argue that we want to demonstrate the kind of love modeled by Jesus. Now, I don't mean to imply that this is a straightforward task, because love might look very different depending on the context. So on the one hand, Jesus demonstrated love of God, love of neighbor through the many compassionate interactions with the poor, the sick. But he also took a very strong stance against the money lenders and vendors in the temple courts. And presumably, even the use of a whip and the turning over of tables was motivated by love, as strange as this may seem to us. And so to help us understand maybe what this might look like to speak the truth in love in our context, this morning or this afternoon I'm going to be highlighting 3 virtues that can aid in this task: humility, generosity, and courage. I'm also going to speak about some challenges to speaking in love by exploring some psychological processes that might get in the way. And then finally, I'm going to speak about some practices that might help us to make some progress in this. But first, I think we need to talk a little bit more about love. So we know that God is love. We know that as people who know God, our lives are supposed to be defined by love. And we also know that this is supposed to be evident not only toward those whom it is easy to love, but also in our actions with other people who are more difficult to love. So this is clear. But what's much murkier is what love actually looks like in these situations. I think part of the problem is that love is a term that has substantial cultural baggage in our context. So in our contemporary culture, one of the first automatic associations to love is romantic love, true love, which is sometimes seen as kind of the highest form of love. But this default to thinking about love primarily in terms of romantic love is really problematic. So first of all, it focuses more on the feelings of love at the expense of the other elements of love, the cognitive and volitional and behavioral elements of love. But feeling-based love can be not particularly helpful when we are trying to love people who are not intrinsically lovable. Romantic notions of love can also tend to be rather self-centered. We love the loved one primarily in relationship to our own needs, and when we feel like that person has stopped meeting our needs in some way, then our love feelings go away and is lost. And this really is not a good representation of the biblical concept of love. In fact, if anything, I would say that a better paradigm is to understand the love of a parent for their child. And so, for example, in Scripture, we read of God's love in the form of the parable of the prodigal son, which shows a father's love, a love that is one of sustained desire for the good of the son, of the other, even when the son is acting in very unlovable ways. And it's a love that is sustained over the long term and that is sacrificial in nature. So that's one problem with the cultural baggage around love. Another issue is that we often confuse love with simply being nice. We live in a society where autonomy and self-determination are really highly valued. And in this context, sometimes we understand love primarily as letting others have their own way, tolerating or even affirming the exercise of autonomy and self-determination. But letting others have their own way is often profoundly unloving. Something that I think every parent in the room can resonate with. A few years ago, my psychologist friend overheard the following comment from her son to my son, who were both about 8 years old and were sitting in the back seat of the car as she drove them somewhere. And her son said, "It sucks having parents who are psychologists because they read all the research on violent video games and don't let you play them." To which my son, of course, agreed. Now, we got a kick out of this, but the question is, does that mean that we are unloving parents? I mean, clearly not. Because we love them, we're willing to put up with their complaining about the limits that we put on their video game use. And so I think it's very clear when we think through it that love can't be reduced to simply being nice. So these cultural understandings of love are not what I am talking about. So what guidance do we have to really kind of flesh out this notion of how we should conduct ourselves lovingly, especially in these difficult conversation type settings that we are talking about today? Now, there's a catchphrase that floats around our conservative Christian world, what would Jesus do? It's kind of cliche, but there's actually some real truth here, because it does seem that biblical understandings of how to live out a loving way of being in the world have to start with what Jesus did. And so the Apostle Paul in particular seems to have a distinct vision of how this Christian approach to life and shows up in interpersonal encounters in a way that's very tightly tied to what Jesus did, and specifically what Jesus did on the cross. And so here I pull on the work of theologian Michael Gorman, who argues that Paul's notion of love was essentially linked to Paul's understanding of the cross as the most distinct expression of God's love in Christ. According to him, love is cross-shaped or cruciform. And this connection between love and the cross can be seen very clearly in passages such as the one on your screen from Galatians. "The life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me by giving himself for me." And so based on this connection, Gorman argues that the essential character of love is put in negative terms, that it does not seek its own advantage or edification, and put in positive terms, that it seeks the good, the advantage, the edification of others. It's kind of its primary characteristics. And he also notes that working for the good of others plays out in three patterns in the life of Jesus: in self-giving ways, in status-renouncing ways, and in sacrificial ways. And I think that these three patterns that Gorman notes suggests these three virtues that really can be helpful to us in fleshing out what it means to love others: generosity and humility and courage, respectively. Now, philosophers who study virtues tell us that one way of understanding what the virtues are is they are habits of loving action and reaction. They are intended to help us to love well. That is the purpose of the virtues. So let's look briefly at each of these patterns and their associated virtues to try to spell out what implications they might have for our engagement in difficult conversations. Let's begin with self-giving love and the virtue of generosity. So Christ demonstrated this kind of love in a fully self-involving act to benefit others. We're told in Ephesians that he gave himself up for us. He gave himself up. So Jesus' love was generous in nature. So being loving involves the virtue of generosity, and it involves giving of ourselves, giving of our time, our commitment, giving of our intellectual resources. Being generous with others in the context of difficult conversations may also be reflected in the ways that we choose to interpret their comments, giving them the benefit of the doubt, seeking to understand what they're saying in the best possible light instead of going to the worst possible interpretation. So something like selecting a snippet out of someone's speech, out of context, completely out of context, and posting it on social media might be an anti-example, right? It's a profoundly ungenerous act in the ways that we are talking about. Let's move on to the status-renouncing nature of love and the associated virtue of humility. Christ's love also involved a deliberate abandoning of status and self-interest in order to act out of love for others. In other words, his love was humble. Paul has kind of a lengthy exposition of this that is found in an early hymn in Philippians 2. And in verse 2 of this, he encourages the Philippians to have the same love as Christ. And then, starting in verse 3, he spells out what this means. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. And then it follows a kind of a lengthy exposition of the lengths to which Christ went to love us in this profoundly humble way. So how might humility show up in difficult conversations? I think there's a few important ways we could pull out. So in several passages, Paul prioritizes love over the exercise of our rights. So being willing to lay aside our rights when they would get in the way of our being loving in conversations, when they would be harmful to people made in God's image, is reflective of Christ's and also Paul's willingness to give up what was due them for the sake of others. So what might this look like? Well, we deserve to be listened to. We deserve to not be attacked. We deserve to be respected. But sometimes when things get heated, that doesn't happen. Are we willing to turn the other cheek in these situations? Not react in defensive ways, but instead act in loving ways to keep the conversation on track. That's one way humility might show up in these conversations. Here's another way. Intellectual humility is another way that humility shows up. And so one of the characteristics of intellectual humility is being aware of our own limitations with respect to our views. When we are aware of the limitations of our understanding, then we can be open to the ideas of others. We can be hospitable toward the ideas of others. So attempting to understand the concerns of others, perspective of others, allowing ourselves to be challenged by them not only demonstrates love, but it actually allows us to engage in the world of ideas without that polarization that I spoke about earlier. One thing I want to make clear here is that being intellectually humble does not mean that we don't have convictions. So having intellectual humility does not mean being wishy-washy about our ideas. In fact, there's a little bit of research that shows that intellectual humility can actually serve as a kind of existential anchor that permits more exploration of alternative perspectives without the fear of being cast adrift. So convictions are not in contrast to intellectual humility, but actually can help us to engage with others in more humble ways. Let me speak of yet another way in which humility is something that we can cultivate in our difficult conversations. Cultural humility is another form of humility that's worth mentioning here. What is cultural humility? Well, it involves being open to understanding another person's identities related to things like race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, social class, education. What other important aspect that has helped to shape their perspective? This sounds to me very similar to what theologian Michael Gorman called the cruciform adaptability that was demonstrated by Paul when he went into cross-cultural situations to preach the gospel. Paul was willing to, in a sense, cater to some of the ethnic and religious and socioeconomic sensitivities of his hearers, giving up on some of the non-essentials in order to make progress in communicating to them. So cultural humility involves being willing to cross boundaries, to go into uncomfortable spaces perhaps, in order to understand where someone else is coming from, why they might be so passionate about the issue that is at stake. The third pattern I want to talk about has to do with sacrificial love and the accompanying virtue of courage. Christ's love involved a costly act to benefit others. Love is sacrificial. Now, to this point, we have primarily focused on the love part of speaking the truth in love, but here I think that we are going to be focusing a bit more on the speaking the truth part of that verse. So when we disagree with others, when we speak with conviction, this may expose us to the anger and the criticism and the attacks of others. And so pursuing what is good for others in terms of an opinion that we think will benefit them can be costly. And so speaking the truth, even in the face of resistance, even when it would be easier to stay silent, may result in suffering. And that's why pursuing the good of others in these ways requires the virtue of courage. Now, courage by itself is not going to get us very far. It must be courage that is motivated by love. And here I want you to just remember the words in that famous treatise on love found in 1 Corinthians 13, which says, if I deliver up my body to be burned, an act of great courage, but have not love, I gain nothing. And in fact, that passage goes on to spell out some of the ways that love is acted out that reflects a courageous stance. Love is patient, love bears all things, love endures all things. And this is certainly something that we can see in Jesus' courageous and costly love. It took the form of patient endurance of the cross and its suffering. It took the form of silence in the face of accusations and threat. It also took the form of denunciation of some of the hypocrisy and callousness that he saw in the Jews around him. And as I mentioned earlier, that bold action in the temple. And in fact, some of these courageous acts were part of what precipitated the cross, leading the events leading to his death. I've left this virtue of courage to the last because I think that if you are representative of the research findings, this may actually be the virtue that you struggle with the most. I noted earlier that high percentages of students on college campuses are reluctant to discuss controversial topics. And here's why this is particularly problematic. In highly polarized societies such as ours, what social scientists refer to as the in-group moderates play a crucial role in our society. Research shows that the most extreme voices are also the loudest voices. They're the ones that get represented the most out in the public forum. And I think this is really easy to see in, for example, in social media. But most people are not extreme. Most people are what some have called the silent moderates or the exhausted majority. And moderates tend to stay quiet because when they take the risk of standing up, even to their own groups, often they are trying to bring a voice of reason or moderation to the discussion, but they can suffer because they are then attacked or shut down. But if the moderates stay quiet, nothing is ever going to change. Polarization is never going to reverse itself. And so I think this is where courage comes in. We need people to speak up, even when they are at risk of being attacked by their own friends. In other words, we need more Neville Longbottoms. We need more cruciform, courageous love. Now, I mentioned earlier that love can be understood in negative terms as not seeking its own advantage or edification. Here's the problem. Unfortunately, in our fallen state, seeking our own advantage seems to be our default mode. In attempting to follow Jesus' example in our controversial discussions with others, we might find that our default ways of interacting with the world are a hindrance. And here's where psychology might be a partner with us in learning to love well, because psychology has a long history of exploring and documenting the many ways in which we seem to be hardwired to seek our own advantage. And so a growing awareness of our own psychological processes, of our own defaults, may allow us to cooperate more fully with the Holy Spirit in counteracting these automatic pursuits of self-interest. And so for the next few minutes, I want to explore with you the psychological literature showing that when we are responding to controversial issues and people in our environment, the deck is stacked against us psychologically with respect to responding with love, because our largely automatic processes are going to be self-centered and aimed at protecting ourselves and our groups. So in the cognitive sciences, there is widespread consensus that typical responses to difficult issues are going to involve the combined responses of two interacting cognitive systems. We take in information and arrive at conclusions and then respond behaviorally in our environment using two systems of processing, often labeled System 1 and System 2 processing, that have been popularized by psychologist Daniel Kahneman as fast and slow thinking. These roughly correspond to what in ordinary language we might call intuition and reflection. And so System 1 processing, intuition, is going to be rapid, non-conscious, automatic. At its most basic level, it is subsymbolic, which means that it's not symbolized in language. Instead, it's primarily emotional. Originally, it's kind of this diffuse background type of emotion, such as when we have a sense of well-being or when we have a feeling of unsettledness or of something being wrong. Eventually, it might result in more discrete emotions, such as fear or anger or contempt. And this knowledge is the result of the brain's automatic appraisal of information, both from the environment and from the body. And this appraisal largely occurs, as I said earlier, outside of our conscious awareness. And it's a very useful system. It helps us to determine whether a stimulus, such as an opinion that someone has just offered, is good or bad, and prepares us to act accordingly by mobilizing our bodies for certain courses of action. In contrast, System 2 processing, what we might call reflection, tends to be slower and conscious and linear, and it's capable of more abstract and rule-based logic. When I say it's linear, it means that one piece of knowledge follows from another in a sequential line. Each piece of information is processed in our brain one at a time. It's logical, meaning that there are certain premises that necessarily follow from others, and we can articulate how we arrive at the conclusions that we arrive at. And it's also language-based. It exists and is processed in words. And finally, it's conscious, meaning that we actually have to pay conscious attention to exercise our System 2 functioning. Both of these systems in combination contribute to our engagement with others in a way that reveals a self-centered bias in what is known in the psychological literature as motivated reasoning. So we tend to form and hold beliefs that are self-serving. We are motivated to hold favorable thoughts about ourselves, our talents, and our social standing. So, for example, research has demonstrated that we on average believe that we are more popular, more intelligent, more attractive, better drivers, that we weigh less than others, and even that we are more likely to get into heaven than Mother Teresa. Motivated reasoning also extends to protecting our group, our tribe, the group of people that share fundamental values with us, such as our political or our religious groups. In other words, people feel protective, not just of themselves, but of their in-groups. So let me explain a bit more how these two systems, System 1 and System 2, interact to support a self-centered and way of kind of engaging in these difficult conversations. But let me begin by dispelling a myth. Sometimes we Christians tend to be suspicious of emotions, and we tend to be enamored of rationality. And so I have often encountered the assumption that system one, which is heavily influenced by emotions, is the bad system. And system two, which is more rational, is the good system. And as we'll see, this is actually not the case. Both can be very helpful in navigating life, and both are also flawed. In theological terms, we might say that both were designed by God for our good, and both are influenced by sin. So let's start with system one processing. System one processing, intuition, depends on heuristics, which are a kind of shortcuts or rules of thumb that usually, but not always, lead to the right conclusion. These heuristics are generally very adaptive. They're very helpful in allowing us to respond to the environment. But research has showed that they are also biased in some self-serving ways. For example, they selectively affect what we perceive in the environment, what we see in the environment. In other words, people see what they want to see. With respect to beliefs, system one processing results in a tendency to accept beliefs that we want to believe and to reject beliefs that we don't want to believe. As I said earlier, emotions play a substantial role in system one processing. So even before we stop and think about ideas, we're already going to be biased for or against an idea, depending on whether our initial emotional system one reaction signaled threat or signaled relief, depending on whether they detract from or advance our self-interest or the self-interest of our group. In fact, research tracking brain activation after exposure to a threatening stimulus, such as hearing a controversial opinion, suggests that this biased information processing occurs so quickly that there is no time for that system two conscious faculty to be aware of it. So, in summary, in terms of system one, when we hear an opinion that differs from ours, our emotions alert us to a potential threat. We may even feel emotions such as anger or disgust or fear in response to that controversial idea, and so we intuitively move away from it and toward ideas that keep us and our group safe. And we might jump to conclusions about the issue, seeing in the environment only what is consistent with our position. How about system two processing? How does that come in? So this system, which draws on evidence and reasoning, also has a role in motivated reasoning. And here, research shows that system two processing is subject to a form of self-serving bias called my-side bias. And here, what people do is that they selectively search for evidence that supports desired claims and refutes undesired claims. We also tend to have a lower standard of evidence for desired claims than for undesired claims. So put in simple terms, when we want to believe a claim, we ask with respect to the evidence, can I believe it? And when we don't want to believe a correct claim, we ask, must I believe it? I also want to point out that my-side bias seems to be independent of intelligence. While more intelligent people are able to produce more arguments for or against a position, these arguments tend to be biased toward their own position. They tend to show my-side bias. And in fact, it's been found that more analytical people tend to show more my-side bias. So in summary, when we engage with morally charged issues that we perceive as being important to us and to our social group, such as our particular stance on the relationship between science and religion, system one processing elicits a sense of threat, which predisposes us to kind of entrench in our position and reject and attack opposing positions. And then when system two processing kicks in, we selectively look for support for our position, and we tend to ignore or downplay contrary evidence and perspectives. And so these combined processes are what lead to this kind of ideological and affective polarization that I spoke of earlier. So what should we do? How can we move forward with speaking the truth in love, given how our brains seem to be wired against this? So let's turn now to exploring some strategies for overcoming our self-serving tendencies and cultivating these three virtues that help us to enact love. When we think of counteracting our self-serving tendencies, the overall goal is going to be to influence System 1 responses so that they facilitate loving engagement instead of producing that automatic defensive reaction, which leads to this polarization that I spoke of earlier. But here's the challenge. While changing System 1 processing needs to be the primary goal, it's not actually that easy to change directly. Instead, what seems to work best is to target System 2 processing, which then ends up indirectly affecting System 1 processing. Now, again, I want to clarify here that we're targeting System 1 processing not because it's the problematic system in contrast to System 2 processing, but simply because System 1 processes are activated first. And so if we want to just kind of thwart the negative cycle from the get-go, we need to try to influence the System 1 reaction to start off with. Now, my review of the psychological literature on how people change has led me to a surprising conclusion that perhaps should not have surprised me, which is that the biblical writers and the early church mothers and fathers actually knew what they were talking about. And so it turns out that many of the ancient spiritual disciplines do exactly this. They change our hearts through the use of intentional System 2-based practices. In the book of Colossians, Paul frames the cultivation of love by using a clothing metaphor, and he instructs believers to put on love along with its supporting virtues. So it would appear from what Paul says here and in other places that enacting love is not an automatic process, but instead we have to clothe ourselves daily in love. And we can do this in a way that's informed by the research that I discussed earlier about dual processing theory. Now, the New Testament assures us of the aid of the Holy Spirit in this transformation, but the frequent commands to love imply that it also requires effort. And so let me recommend some intentional System 2 processes that can help us to cultivate love, to put on love. To cultivate generosity, let me suggest the practice of gratitude. When we practice gratitude to God, we're acknowledging that everything that we have comes from God. And it also acknowledges God's sovereign involvement in all of our lives. And so when we regularly practice this kind of awareness, then some of the grasping of our resources, of our rights, can loosen its grips a bit. It can free us from those automatic reactions of anger and fear and other reactions that get in the way of or that serve as barriers to a more generous spirit toward others. And there's quite a bit of research that confirms that when we are aware of how much we've been given, when we practice gratitude, that we're more open to giving to others. We're more generous. Everything that we have has been given to us, and so when we're aware of that, we're free to be generous to others. And so one simple practice is to end the day, each day, by thinking of 3 things that have happened that day for which we are grateful. And according to several studies, even very simple practices like this one can influence the world, the way that we see the world, and the ways that we interact with others. So that instead of reacting in ways to cut off communication or cancel others, instead we're willing to engage with others. We're willing to hear their perspective and show generosity, both in terms of our time and our emotional energy. How about humility? To cultivate humility, I recommend the practices that were actually encouraged by Jesus, starting with the most general injunction to love your enemies, which is what we've been talking about a lot this afternoon. Jesus then moves into specific practices to help in cultivating this kind of love. After saying, love your enemies, he says, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. So how might practicing those disciplines recommended by Jesus help us in our attempt to speak the truth in love? The first thing that they do is they help us to interrupt that System 1 tendency to stereotype people who are different from us. When we are praying for others and when we are blessing others, when we are bringing them to mind in these benevolent ways, we pay careful attention to who the other person is. And this helps us to interrupt that System 1 tendency to other people, to stereotype people who hold to differing perspectives than ours. And research shows that when inaccuracies in our assumptions about others are corrected, when instead we find common ground with them in our humanity, that this decreases the hostility that we have toward others. There are some other practices, some other things that we can intentionally do to avoid stereotyping others. One very simple strategy is simply to find out more about the other person. So let me give you an example that was actually really startling to me. One of the biggest areas of polarization in our current culture is, of course, political, between Democrats and Republicans. And so people have very defined stereotype about what the average Democrat and the average Republican looks like. And yet it turns out that the modal member of both of these groups, the most representative member, is a middle-aged, white, non-evangelical Christian. Who knew? So love attempts to see people for who they are rather than assuming that we know who the other person is. We're told to do to others what we want them to do to us, and certainly we don't like others to make unwarranted assumptions about our values or our motives. And so love attempts to see people who they are rather than making assumptions, especially unwarranted assumptions about them. Another thing we can do to cultivate humility is to focus on the things that we have in common instead of the things that divide us. We can focus on our common humanity, the fact that we are all created in God's image for loving relationships with God and others, that we're loved by God, and that consequently we're someone who deserves to be loved by followers of God. And when we do this consistently, when we do this in ways that put on love, what ends up happening is that those people become a part of our group. They become a part of our tribe in ways that allow us to not trigger those System 1 stereotypical rejections of them because they are outside of our tribe. And so we can do this when we think intentionally about what the motivations are for other people's perspectives. We can do this when we think about what kinds of common ground we might have with other people. So humanizing others is an important step in demonstrating love to them. What about courage? Here, cultivating a sense of God's loving presence in our lives can help us to stand firm and grow in a sense of courage. One interesting thing when you start thinking about it is that Scripture consistently pairs courage with God's presence. So, for example, Joshua was told to be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And this, of course, this pairing occurs in other places as well. And so one daily practice, one System 2 practice that can be done very easily is before going to sleep each night, ask, where have I met Jesus? Or where have I met the Holy Spirit or God today? Psychology tells us that one great detractor from moral courage is what is known in psychology as diffusion of responsibility. When we are part of a group, we may feel less personal responsibility to speak up. We just assume that other people will do that. Research also shows that we are more likely to combat this diffusion of responsibility. We're more likely to intervene in a situation when we feel responsible for the welfare of other people. And this goes back to that common humanity. In other words, when we see others as being part of our tribe, when we have cultivated love for them, we're more willing to step up. As we become more aware of God's presence and love for us, we begin to see others as God sees them, as objects of love, and someone for whom we are willing to act, for whom we are willing to sacrifice, for whom we are willing to exercise courage. So let me wrap up our time by reminding you that learning to live well is a lifelong process. In theological language, we call it sanctification, and when we are intentional about cooperating with the Holy Spirit by reflecting on our selfish moral intuitions and emotions, and when we repent of our failures to engage lovingly with others, and when we practice loving others well, we are slowly able to change those automatic responses of both System 1 and System 2 in ways that are consistent with our commitments to imitate Jesus in loving others. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, we're told, let all that you do be done in love. And so engaging with others who are difficult, who are different from us, who hold opinions that may strike us as dangerous or incomprehensible, it's never easy. Standing up to friends when they are lacking in love is challenging. But in Ephesians chapter 4, we're encouraged to grow up and engage with others as individuals who are formed in Christ's image and leave behind these childish, impulsive ways. We have to learn not just to speak the truth, but to speak the truth in love. Speaking with amazingly persuasive arguments is absolutely worthless without love, according to 1 Corinthians 13. So with generosity, let me encourage you to give of your time and energy, to make the effort to build bridges instead of walls. And with humility, let me encourage you to carefully consider the needs and perspectives of the other. And with humility, to choose whether to sacrifice your safety or your pride for the sake of others. And over all these virtues, let me encourage you to put on love, which we're told binds them all together in perfect unity. Thank you.
Time for questions. I've got a mic that I can bring around so that everyone can hear your questions. So just let me know if you'd like to ask something and I can bring it by.
So I'm real interested in System 1, System 2,
Yeah.
thinking fast and slow. Right now, it seems like, well, in the past, college was about, in many ways, System 2, right? We're learning more information. We're trying to be reasonable. We learn logic. We learn to distrust our bodies and distrust our emotions.
Yeah.
Right now, a lot of conversation is trust your body, trust your feelings. These are good God-given parts. How do you help students to do that conversation back and forth between kind of the trust your body, trust your feelings,
Yeah.
and learn to reflect on it and to learn to use logic and more information and reason?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to humility, doesn't it? Because there's a sense in which we want to appreciate both what our System 1 and our System 2 ways of processing do for us. They're both incredibly important in just navigating life. But I think that in humility, we also want to, you talk about trusting it, and it's trusting it while also acknowledging that as finite creatures and as people who have been affected by sin, we need, for example, the input of wise others instead of just proceeding forward with what our gut tells us or with the argument that seems very persuasive to us. And so I think this is why, like in the New Testament especially, there's so much emphasis put on living life together in community, because I think that we get in trouble when we're just following our own trends, when we're just relying on ourselves completely to do both of these things. And it's really when we're getting feedback from others, when we're seeing things from other people's perspectives, people who might have other biases than ours. It's not that they're not biased, it's that they have been shaped and formed in different ways that we get, I think, a little bit of a clearer vision. So you're right, it is tricky, because on the one hand, and I'm a clinical psychologist, so I feel like a lot of work that I do in therapy, for example, is trying to help people to actually pay attention to what goes on inside of themselves and to be informed by that. But not as kind of like this infallible guide to living, but rather as one more among different sources of information that we need to kind of look at and evaluate and get input on from trusted others. Yeah.
Well, I have a question. Oh, here, I'm going to give it to Erin, and then I'll ask mine next.
Thank you for your talk. I was thinking about System 1 and System 2 and their different gifts, and where we err when we rely on them. And it seems often like in the difficult conversations, it's very fast-paced. And it seems like it discourages System 2 thinking because you have to be responding immediately, synthesizing all these thoughts. So do you have any tips or ideas about how to promote System 2 thinking in those sorts of conversations?
Yeah. I think because of the challenges that we're facing in society these days, there are different groups who now have put together programs to help people to have more civilized conversations with each other. And one of the things that I'm struck by as I hear kind of the approaches that they take is they often spend significant amounts of time preparing to have the difficult discussion. So that rather than just jumping in and having the discussion, they set parameters, but they also encourage people to spend a lot of time doing some of the things I've talked about here before even starting on the difficult conversations. So hearing from other people what they're, what is motivating them, what's important to them, trying to find some common ground, humanizing them before jumping into the difficult conversations. So that can be one way of slowing down the pace of what happens. Another one is to have signals in the conversation, like agreed on types of, I'm not sure what to call them, but like catchphrases that people can use when it feels like the conversation is so bound up in kind of this automatic reactive System 1 processing that everybody just needs to calm down and take a breath before proceeding. And so having just a phrase that anybody can invoke at any time, and that means that people need to just remain quiet for a while, is helpful. Then there's just the very old strategy that has been taught in marital counseling for years of requiring you to articulate what the other person said to that person's satisfaction until that person feels heard before you can respond to what they're saying. And so that's another good one for really slowing down the conversation and making sure that people are not speaking past each other. So there's, some tips, but yeah.
Well, here, I'll ask my question then. So I'm thinking about times when I've tried to have conversations like this, when I feel like I've been willing to give a little and try to be humble and try to be generous, and the other party isn't willing to sort of reciprocate that. And I think, like in some cases, we might think, well, we just need to sort of maybe not interact in that way with this particular group. But in some cases, especially when it's family or someone that you're really close with, like I feel like we still need to sort of be living into that. And so I wonder, like, what kind of advice you would have, especially when we're dealing with family on issues like this, to try to get them to reciprocate some of these virtues so that we can really have a great dialogue together.
So a couple things come to mind. One is just that idea of being willing to lose the battle in order to win the war. So having a long-term perspective on the relationship rather than feeling like in every conversation you need to be able to get your point across might be one way of doing it. The other thing that comes to mind for me is, again, just this very basic idea that I invoke a lot in doing therapy with others, that you can only take responsibility for things that you have control over. And I find that very helpful. It might be that in some of these situations, you never get the person to react in the way that they should by listening to you and your perspective and having a good conversation or that kind of thing. But some of what I've talked about here, if it's somebody that you are in, especially in an ongoing relationship with, it might be worth it to be the one who is willing to not, who's willing to turn the other cheek, who's willing to continue to say things and be non-reactive when the other person comes back. I think that there can be some power, if not, we wouldn't be taught to do that, and just the wearing away, when we consistently model love and patience and endurance, that might open up conversations in the long term. I can think of a couple of examples when that's been the case. Just the person ends up being won over just by the fact that there is both persistence and also gentleness in the way that they are engaged with. Yeah.
Takes courage, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk.
My question is, I feel like in college it's really easy to slip into friend groups where you kind of just have an echo chamber of just your own idea being repeated and reiterated, and it makes it even more difficult to nuance your perspective. How would you recommend going about creating relationships with people who might not have similar perspectives without making it feel like you're going in it to be combative with them?
Yeah. That's a great question. I'm not sure that I have a lot of answers to that. One would just be that classrooms tend to throw all kinds of people together. And so conversations that are allowed to happen in classrooms might be one way of doing that. There could also be groups. I don't know if your club has, my university has clubs that are organized around all kinds of different positions, for example. And so there might be events that are held that are for the purposes of not debate, but dialogue, right? Where maybe one of these systems of civil dialogue that are out there could be used to bring together people that are known to have different political persuasions or opinions on a certain controversial topic or that kind of thing, to engage with others in productive ways. On our campus, for example, we have a program called the Winsome Conviction Project that it brings together students from local secular colleges. And so some of our students will spend a weekend talking to people from other colleges, again, with some preparatory activities, and then trying to get some traction around some difficult issues with which they disagree, sometimes very strongly with others. And students that I know who have engaged in the Winsome Conviction Project come back just glowing at the success. It's so invigorating to feel that this is something that can actually happen. You can actually communicate in a way that where you feel understood and you feel you've understood somebody else, even if they're very, very different from you. I think that produces hope that that can happen in future conversations as well.
We've got time for another question or two if you have it.
Hi, I'm stuck on your comment about sometimes it's better to let the non-essential things go.
Yeah.
And it's something I've been struggling a lot with in my own life right now. What does it mean to, not eat meat if you're offended by meat and the issues that I consider, maybe I don't consider confessional, somebody else considers confessional. Can you give us some, maybe your tips that you use with your clients to say what is essential and what are some of the things that you let go?
That's a great and a very practical question. So I tend to think in terms of rights and in terms of what we demand from others. And I'm thinking particularly a lot of times when my clients are talking about these things, it's in the context of difficult family situations. And so when things are going well in a family, then everybody's needs are taken into account. And so where you vacation and what kind of meals you have and whose house you go to and who brings what and all that kind of thing is shared equitably. But sometimes we have to give up on the non-essentials in order to make progress in the relationship. So to give up what's fair. What's fair is my food preferences to be taken into account. What's fair is my preferred vacation being done. But sometimes in order to love somebody else well, when it's a situation where there's danger maybe of the relationship being cut off or that kind of thing, it's worth having the vacation over here instead of over there so that you get to engage with the other person and demonstrate that you love them and that you're wanting to pursue that relationship and that kind of thing. So those are at least some of the areas that we might talk about. Being willing to and this one's tricky. So I said earlier in conversations, we might have to give up our right to be respected or acknowledged or heard. This is a tricky one. I think that I would probably not emphasize this a lot with clients. This might be the kind of thing that would work when I'm talking about a classroom conversation. The problem in a clinical setting is sometimes there are relationships that are so abusive that you don't necessarily want the person to continue to do the things that they have done, which is just perpetuate, it's enabling, a kind of negative relationship. But so there's some wisdom, another virtue that I didn't even talk about today, to try to decide when it's a good idea to kind of give up on some of those things that might seem as non-essential, and when in fact they are essential in a relationship. So it would be nice if I could give you a really clear answer, but I feel like in this area there's so much kind of contextual information that we need to take into account that I'm not sure that I can be very clear with it, but yeah. I am, yeah. What's important in that relationship? And of course, relationships vary, and the types of commitments that we're supposed to have in relationships vary. And even when we speak of love, one of the ways that philosophers and theologians talk about love is the offices of love, right? I mean, love looks different when you're talking about your child than when you're talking about your neighbor, than when you're talking about, this person in Africa, right? So what's essential in those relationships is going to differ as well.
Yeah, one more question.
Okay, thank you, first of all. My question is more about the system to my side bias.
Yes.
So as college students or as Christians, when we become aware that we have a very strong bias and that we want the answer to go a certain way, how do you suggest we begin to deconstruct that bias and then approach researching the question and talking with people when we know that it's so deeply ingrained that we want the answer to be a certain thing?
Yeah. So my first recommendation would not be to just Google the answers. Because, of course, we know that what is likely to show up first is going to be things that thing known as the internet knows or Google knows we want to hear. So we have to learn, part of a good college education is learning which sources we can trust. And so look for the good sources. I mean, if it's kind of maybe in an academic area, look for the peer-reviewed, articles, and then evaluate. Even those, of course, can have some bias in them. But if we read widely enough, we may be able to start discerning some of the truth that's there. Yeah. But even if you are going to go to the internet, because there's news, for example, you can't go to academic sources. There are some sites now that are created by people who are just tired of polarization, and so they actually side by side show the different perspectives, and then you at least can know what both sides are saying rather than just one, and try to form your opinion based on at least hearing both perspectives rather than just one. Yeah.
Well, thanks to everyone who spent time out of your afternoon to come, and thank you, Liz, for sharing so much wisdom with us today. Please join me in thanking Liz again.